So, some of you might recognize the GIF of the person on the right. He is Descartes, and Descartes was a rationalist. Cognitivism comes from a rationalistic view. This is getting into the kind of philosophy of the thing, but just as a point of interest, rationalism focuses on the distinction between mind and matter, and a belief that knowledge arises through the mind. And I'm sure many of you will be aware of Descartes' most famous kind of credo, which was, I think, therefore I am. So, as I mentioned, Descartes was a rationalist, and rationalists identified that there are ways that concepts and knowledge can be identified and gained independently of self-experience. So, this is kind of a move away from the notion that Um, I suppose almost the behaviorist understanding or the behaviorist viewpoint that kind of you can only understand the world through the kind of what you sense, the information that you take in through your kind of five senses. Um, Cognitivism is of the belief that kind of you can gather information, knowledge, concepts independently of your sense experience. And Descartes' big thing around I think therefore I am was kind of an attempt to kind of almost summarize that kind of regardless of what we see, hear, sense, so on and so forth, even if those were taken away from us, we still have the ability to understand concepts, to gain knowledge, and to kind of develop an awareness of ourselves and the world around us. It will be commonly contrasted, rationalism with empiricism. And I suppose the dispute between rationalism and empiricism, it's kind of based around how much we feel we're dependent on our sense experience in gaining knowledge. An empiricist would claim that sense experience is the ultimate source of all our concepts and knowledge. For any budding philosophers out there or anyone interested in the area, some of the main rationalists, and I know that like I'm kind of very roughly summarizing here, so please don't take this as gospel, but Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz could be considered rationalists, and individuals such as Locke and Robert Boyle could be considered as empiricists. And when we talk about constructivism, that's very much associated from a philosophical point of view with empiricism as opposed to rationalism. Something we talked about in the lecture a bit is, the notion of behaviorism versus cognitivism. So behaviorism being teaching about the what stuff, the factual or replicative knowledge, and cognitivism being taught about the how. So how we process information to a casual understanding. And again, this is somewhat kind of summarized in the slides here, which identifies that behaviorism is all about real, observable, and measurable behaviors on stimulus and response. So, you ring the bell, the dog drools, the rat can be taught to push the lever to get a food pellet, real observable, measurable behaviors, and stimulus and response. And cognitivism then being more about how the brain processes information, perception, memory, and individual difference. And again, like I mentioned in the live lecture, that's why I would see cognitivism as being like very broadly applicable. So for our purposes in e-learning design and development, when we talk about cognitivism, about Mayer's principles, about cognitive information processing, chunking, and kind of all of the elements that arise from that, all of the best practice that arise from that. It's something that's applicable, whatever approach you take, whatever learning theory you apply. It's important that you chunk correctly. It's important that you abide by Mayer's principles. It's important that you're trying to optimize the learning you're developing and that you're putting in front of learners to help them to help their brains process that information, to help them perceive it, to help it get into their memory so that they can retain it. And I guess for the most part, when I talk about a behaviorist approach to learning, I guess that's mainly contrasted with a constructivist or a connectivist approach to learning. I don't know that I would necessarily refer to a cognitivist approach because I think cognitivism, again, when we talk about cognitivism, Mayer's principles, chunking, so on and so forth, it's kind of something that should be done at all levels. whereas a behaviorist approach is maybe more describing, okay, lots of repetition, lots of rote learning. And a constructivist approach is like a very social approach to learning, lots of discussion and work with peers. Cognitivism kind of runs across the entire board. So we talked a bit in the lecture as well about cognitive information processing, that being kind of a set of theories in terms of how information is processed, stored, and retrieved in our minds. And again, kind of as identified there, how information goes from out there, from the world, to in here, into your minds, or in the area of learning, how information becomes stored in your long-term memory for the purposes of recall. And again, the three stages that we identified are sensory store, short-term store, and our long-term store. And just something kind of to note there, information for kind of retrieval purposes is pulled out of our long-term store into our short-term store to work with. So if I'm asking you, for example, to recall, to be able to, for example, phrase something in a second language that you speak, you're kind of pulling the information out of your long-term store into your short-term store so you can repeat it back to me or write it down or whatever. But then that kind of information on how to phrase in the second language goes back into your long-term store when you're not kind of using it. Um, and again, the information that comes into the sensory store is from our senses, what we see, what we hear, what we feel, so on and so forth. Now, as to why CIP is relevant to us, as we mentioned, I suppose it's a huge part of instructional design. How do we design learning content that best fits with this process? And how do we design learning so that information is optimally processed into the sensory store and into the short-term store? And then how is it stored and retrieved in our short-term store to our long-term store and back again? So CIP is really kind of an important maybe thing to be aware of. It's kind of the mechanics of how we take information from out there in the world, um, and how we kind of process and store it for the purposes of learning. Something which I identified in the lecture last week is this kind of stage theory model for CIP at the sensory store versus the short-term store versus long-term store. Again, something we talked about in the lecture, but we can see kind of in terms of capacity. Capacity for a sensory store is very large, capacity for our short-term store is very small, and for our long-term store is very large again. But then, we lose information from the sensory store very, very quickly. We lose information from the short-term store through displacement or decay, which means that kind of new displacement being new information coming in and replacing what's there, or decay being just forgetting about it. And long-term information from a long-term store is lost from irretrievability. And obviously there's differences in terms of duration, coding, source, so on and so forth. But yeah, it's kind of, again, it's not something I think you'll need to have like on the regular, but no harm to maybe have some kind of awareness of this stage theory or model, just as a way of bearing in mind and as kind of as a reference to guide us in terms of, okay, if the focus is on getting stuff into the short-term store, what do we need to be aware of? If the focus is getting information into the long-term store, what are the things we need to kind of bear in mind? And again, hopefully it becomes clear from the lecture and from this video that, like, the mechanics of the different kind of stores or kind of phases here, they do determine best practice in terms of learning experience design. So like for the long-term store, you want to give the learner stuff that helps them, um, drag the memory from kind of their long-term store into the short-term store. So for example, give them mnemonics, give them little kind of prompts and references, give them information that kind of helps them, you know, take the information from the long-term memory into the short-term memory. Whereas if you're talking about getting stuff into the sensory store, things like attention, things like making it, attractive graphics, all of the elements we talked about in terms of attention with the ARCS model and similar, all of that is very important for the sensory store. And for kind of encoding things into the short-term store, then, important to kind of identify how it's relevant to them, get them thinking about how this information could be used in their actual daily lives, so on and so forth. So When we talk about the sensory store, information in the sensory store lasts less than 1 second. So again, the information that we retain in the sensory store, it only stays in there very, very briefly. And the transfer to our working memory or to the short-term store really depends on the attention we're paying to the information when it comes into our sensory store, on pattern recognition. So is this something which is semi-familiar to us? Is this something which is like completely alien to us? You know, if you're a programmer and you're trying to, if you're quite a good programmer and you're familiar with a number of kind of programming languages, and I present you with a new programming language, chances are you will be able to draw on your knowledge of kind of the frameworks or the structures of other programming languages to help you learn this new programming language more quickly. Or for example, if we talk about, let's say you're learning a new language, but you all a new romantic language. So let's say you're learning Italian, but you already speak English or French and or Spanish or similar, you know, chances are you're going to have an understanding of, you know, the structure of those romantic languages. And obviously, it's going to be far easier for you if you kind of have, yeah, kind of some English or German or French or Spanish or whatever. It's going to be easier for you to learn Italian compared to if, for example, you only speak Japanese, because the structure, the format, the approaches for those romantic languages, they're obviously all quite similar to each other, but they'd be very different to something like, for example, Japanese or Hungarian or whatever. So pattern recognition is a big part of how information gets from our sensory store into our short-term store. And I guess, you know, again, that kind of points to instructional design elements or considerations, like trying to get learners to think about similar kind of elements that they might have dealt with in the past. Was there a situation where you had kind of uh, this kind of situation or this kind of scenario, or you had to do this? Well, what you're learning in this course is quite similar by virtue of X, Y, Z. So kind of getting their attention, kind of trying to dredge up some kind of pattern recognition out of learners, those are kind of important elements. And it's a pre-categorical high capacity memory store. And what that means really is it's pre-categorical. It's kind of like raw information. It's information that's coming in, and it's our short-term kind of store that does the heavy lifting around, like, um, you know, taking that information and figuring out, okay, well, this is a little bit like this other thing that I'm aware of, or I kind of recognize this pattern in this way. For the sensory store, it's just that first phase. It's kind of taking in everything. It's not trying to categorize or sort it. It's just kind of bringing everything in. And I identified there, if you want to think about your sensory store, I don't know if any of you have ever had the experience, but you walk into a room that's well lit, and if you turn off the light, you can kind of, your brain kind of retains almost this outline of what was in the room. So you can't see what was there, but just for a split second, you kind of have, okay, the bed is over there and it's this dimension, and that lamp is there and the lamp looks like this. It's almost like an outline of what was there kind of burned into your retina. So that's kind of like what the sensory store is like. It's like that split second kind of recollection of what the room looks like after you flick off the light. One kind of interesting experiment around the sensory store was done by Sperling, excuse me. So he identified that a lot of information is actually registered in the sensory store, but it decays very quickly. So there's a huge amount of information goes in, but it's lost quite quickly. And he conducted an experiment based around this notion of free recall, and he verified the results of it by introducing additional auditory information. So basically what that means is I'm going to show you a table on the next slide. I'm going to show it to you very, very briefly, but I want you to try and remember what is on that slide. So 3, 2, 1. So, what letters do you remember from that previous slide? There's no need to write them down or anything. Just take a second to think about how many of those 9 letters can you actually remember. So, excuse me, that was the basis of Stirling's experiment. he showed that grid of 9 letters to participants for 1/20th of a second. And what he found was that most participants were able to remember like 4 to 5 letters out of the 9 that they were given. Um, and that led this actually became kind of a method called free recall, which is where people are required to study a list of items, and they're prompted to recall the items in any order they want, which is why it's called free recall, because you don't have to remember it as part of a sequence or in a particular order. Um, and basically, yeah, that's kind of a method which can still be used nowadays, that notion of free recall. It's you kind of show someone something very, very quickly, and then you ask them to bring up to repeat as many of the things in whatever order they wish. And what Sterling found was that, so people remember, or Sperling found was that people remember like 4 to 5 letters out of the 9, and he figured out that was because people, not because people didn't see all of the letters, but because their minds couldn't retain all the information in that short of an exposure time. So what Sperling did then basically was he told them beforehand that he would show them the grid for a 20th of a second, and what he would do is he would sound a tone afterwards. So show them the grid. After that, he was going to play them a tone. A high tone meant the letters in row 1. A medium tone meant the letters in row 2. A low tone meant the letters in row 3. And what he found was that when he did that, the recall was almost 100%. So he would show them the exact same grid for 1/20th of a second, and afterwards he would play this high tone that people knew was associated with the first row, and people would remember as the letters on that row. And the same for row 2 and the same for row 3. So through this he was able to identify, oh, people are taking all of this information in, they're just not able to recall absolutely everything in that short of a time frame. But if I give them some kind of cue, some kind of additional element, I am able to identify, oh, actually they do, even though they might, let's say, on a free recall basis, like only remember the first 2 rows, if I play them that low tone and they're aware of it, they actually did remember the last row. They just need that additional kind of step to help them kind of recall it. And obviously something which I mentioned in the lecture, which affects sensory store and transfer information into memory, is attention. So attention being a huge element. And when we spoke about the ARCS model, obviously we spoke about the importance of attention and a few different ways to do it in terms of inquiry, surprise, incongruity, so on and so forth. And an interesting experiment, which should be available in Canvas as well, is that monkey business experiment, where you can draw people's attention to a particular element, and that will almost exclude some quite unusual elements from their attention also. So they may not be able to, um, they might um, uh, basically not take in certain kind of information because you've drawn their attention to very specific elements. And again, the relevance of that experiment for our purposes, I guess, is really like, if you want to make people aware, you know you want to draw people's attention to the most important elements for learning, because whatever you're drawing people's attention to, it's going to be at the cost of something else on screen. And that is important for chunking as well, that if there is a danger of important information being lost because there's too much of it up on screen, you're better off splitting that into additional across additional screens. Um, Short-term or working memory then is the kind of middle row, or the middle column rather, and again quite small capacity, but there is the potential for that information to be encoded into our long-term store. So the short-term memory store is almost like, you can think about it as almost like that's what we're working with nearly the entire time. Our sensory store is taking information in the entire time. Our long-term store, we're dragging from that quite frequently, but the short-term store is kind of where the processing has happened and where it's decided to a degree whether the information should be kind of encoded into our long-term memory or discarded. So kind of the short-term store is what kind of our sensory store feeds, and it's where it's decided, okay, this should go into long-term store because that's probably going to be handy. This information from the sensory store isn't worth worrying about, so it's discarded. It's identified there. It's either displaced which means new information comes in and replaces it, or decay, which is basically where it's forgotten. So it's a stage after the sensory store at which further processing happened, and kind of the short-term memory and working memory, they're interchangeable terms. You don't need to kind of worry too much about those. Um, it's carried out to make information ready for the long-term memory or an immediate response, and short-term memory is not only limited in terms of duration, but also in terms of capacity. So again, there's that notion that our short-term memory or our working memory, it has a small capacity. So, there's only so much that can take in. In terms of duration, and other experiments that Peterson and Peterson did set the duration of working memory at about 18 to 20 seconds for unrehearsed information, but it can sometimes be as low as 15 seconds. And that experiment was based on presenting people with trigrams, like three groupings of letters, and asking them to count backwards. Basically, it was it was basically that. We don't need to get too into that, but it was about that kind of they found that kind of about 18 20 seconds for unrehearsed information. We did this kind of minor kind of experiment in class. This is kind of really related to chunking, but just it's a process of, in terms of how we present information. This is obviously quite difficult to remember. This is far easier for people to remember, and that is, just a question of how you structure and present, information to learners. That is the exact same information as this. It's just presented in a way which is more amenable and more kind of understandable to them. Now, another important thing for the sensory store and for our kind of short-term memory is this notion of dual encoding theory. And that is basically a theory about how images are processed by the mind. Now, obviously, this leads quite directly onto the whole area of Mayer's principles and all the rules that go along with that. But basically, in our brains, we have two sensory subsystems. We have a verbal subsystem, which processes and stores linguistic information, and a visual subsystem or nonverbal subsystem, which processes and stores nonverbal information, such as images or picture-like representation. You don't need to worry too much about these kind of terms because they're a bit notiony, but basically logogens is a memory unit for verbal information, and imagens is a memory unit for non-verbal information. So again, you can just consider those like units for our verbal subsystem and for our non-verbal subsystem. And obviously there's quite a bit of interrelationship between those two systems because as human beings we are almost evolutionarily uh, designed to be able to kind of associate the meaning of images with kind of our verbal understanding of what those are. And I guess again one of the main, if not the main principle in terms of Mayer's principles is just that the multimedia principle of um, the we learn better from text and graphics than just kind of text by itself. So information is easier to retain and retrieve when it is dual coded. So using text and graphics is more likely to activate both coding systems, which means that there's double the chance of us remembering that information or processing that information into our sensory or into our short-term memory and therefore into our long-term memory. Um, so yeah, and maybe something of note, just when we do talk about kind of text and images being better than just text by itself, our visual system information can be accessed much faster. So we as human beings tend to think visually as opposed to in terms of text. So using graphics is kind of as opposed to just essentially just not relying kind of fully on text by itself, is kind of, I would say, one of the most, unfortunately, one of the most important, but also unfortunately one of the, even today I would say, still most overlooked elements of Mayer's principles. Just kind of it, we're designed to interpret the world through visuals. It's kind of, it's our eyes. It's one of the most kind of important basic kind of tools we have as organisms. So, using visuals, relying upon our visual system information is a critical element really in terms of learning. And again, for learning experience design purposes, just, the use of graphics in an effective way. And I say in an effective way, obviously, that brings in other elements from Mayer's principles, like the coherence principle, the contiguity principle, so on and so forth. An additional element in terms of cognitivism, but obviously this is something which will kind of tie into behaviorism as well, with behaviorism's kind of focus on rote learning and so on and so forth, is this notion then of rehearsal. So, rehearsal being kind of the repeated recall of information as a way of maintaining it into memory. And I don't know what your experience of kind of secondary education is, but in Ireland, I guess there's an emphasis in secondary in kind of the Leaving Cert, which is kind of our kind of end of secondary school exams. There's a big emphasis on kind of rote learning and just regurgitation of information. And my main memory of the Leaving Cert and studying for the Leaving Cert was really just kind of sitting in a room, repeating information back to myself so I could pull it out for the exam when it was required. So the repeated recall of information as a way of maintaining it in memory. If you want to remember a phone number or a combination code, one of the best examples of rehearsal for that is just repeating it to yourself again, 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 as a way of just encoding it and kind of setting it in stone in your brain. So, and it's a basic, but it'll have to be said, effective way of keeping the requisite information in your head, basically, until you need to use it. The serial position effect refers to trying to recall information as part of a list or as part of a sequence. And what that refers to is basically where the particular items in that sequence are affects how effectively you recall it. So that is basically what the kind of graphic on the right hand side, or on the left hand side, excuse me, kind of refers to. Um, the bottom axis is the position of something in a sequence, and the effectiveness of recall basically is the axis over on the left hand side, the vertical axis there. And basically the idea is that kind of, if I give you a list of words or items or letters or numbers or whatever to remember as part of the sequence, chances are you're going to remember the first one very well, you're going to remember the last one very well, but kind of it's in the middle, and I'm sure we've all experienced this. It's that bit in the middle where things get a little bit iffy, a little bit confusing. So the serial position effect basically determines that items that are first in the sequence and that are last in the sequence are remembered best, are recalled most effectively. Um, and obviously, learning through rehearsal or by rote, it works okay for simple stuff, multiplication tables, list of foreign verbs, things like that. But it's not so good for more complex information, and kind of how that determines learning very much kind of, or how effective that is from a learning perspective. A lot of that does kind of come down to, well, what exactly is this information being used for? If you're just going to quiz me on a list of foreign verbs, like, learning through rehearsal is grand. But if you want to actually have a conversation with someone and all they're able to do is recall that same list of verbs effectively, that's not going to be much use in actually kind of effective kind of language learning. Long-term store then is, as identified by the table, it's got tremendous capacity. Our ability to store information in our long-term store is huge, and the duration is permanent. It's in there forever, but it can be lost due to irretrievability. So information is encoded from the short-term memory to the long-term memory. New information is either assimilated or accommodated. So new information basically is assimilated when it's kind of merged in with the existing schema. So the notion there is really that, schema is kind of almost like how we organize information. So, again, to go back to the notion of, let's say I speak a bit of Italian and French and I'm learning Spanish, you know, uh, the new information about how to speak Spanish, that's going to be assimilated because I'm aware, like I have a schema in my brain to say, okay, this is how romantic languages work. So, the Spanish is going to be kind of brought into that schema. Or, if I'm learning a new programming language, but I know a number of programming languages, I'm going to have a schema, a kind of a system that's in my brain essentially labeled how programming languages work. And that is going to like greatly help me make sense of the new information around, a similar programming language. But accommodation then is for information that like I'm not really familiar with. I don't have an existing kind of category or understanding of it. I don't have any way really of organizing that information. Um, so accommodation of information basically means setting up new schemas, creating new kind of structures in my brain as a way of figuring out how to deal with kind of new and kind of different or difficult or almost like foreign information. And there's two types of long-term memory which Tulving identified: episodic memory and semantic memory. Um, Both of those are referred to as declarative memory, which is basically information that can be verbalized and which we kind of understand, which is conscious. We recognize this as memory. We have an awareness of kind of, this is something that I know about. This is something that I know how to do. Um, Episodic memory is basically memory for information tied to a particular place and time from our own lives. So if, for example, as part of a learning experience design, I was to, as part of a course say, have you ever been in a situation where you need to, know how to chunk information effectively? That's episodic memory. That is kind of, you're going to say, oh yeah, I remember when I was doing this project, I had to do this. So episodic memory is kind of tied to a particular time and place, and it's like, as identified there, it's like a personal video, and that's not generally used for processing new information. It's kind of drawing upon what we already know. Semantic memory then is memory or meaning related to, for example, words, theories, concepts, so on and so forth. Um, so, we would use that as a way of organizing our information around facts, ideas, meanings, not things that kind of, let's say, are from our own lives, but kind of like a more abstract understanding of a particular concept, theory, so on and so forth. Um, and there is also, it's not really relevant, I think, for most of us in terms of what we're talking about here. There's also this thing of procedural memory. And procedural memory is kind of how-to knowledge. And that is in terms of learned skills, but almost skills that our body learns. So riding a bike, for example, is procedural memory. It's not something that you can kind of teach someone necessarily through a screen. It's something that are kind of almost our body has to learn, or that kind of, it's a how-to thing. Um, and an important element then in terms of long-term memory is obviously how information is lost from our long-term memory, and it's basically through a number of different ways, but primarily relates to like basically just how we forget information. So failure to encode is where, for example, I might think I've understood something, but really the encoding from my short-term to my long-term memory is shallow. So I haven't really remembered it. I might think that I have, but I haven't. So a failure to encode. A failure to retrieve is basically my inability to pull information out of my long-term memory into my kind of short-term memory. And that could be any number of things. It could be, it's been displaced by new information. It has, the way in which I remembered it, the way in which I encoded it into my long-term memory is very specific, and this situation isn't kind of, similar enough, or so on and so forth. Then interference is basically kind of, let's say, maybe where uh, basically how I encode it into my long-term memory is interfered with. That interference might be retroactive, by which I mean kind of there is a later learning interference, so kind of things that I learn later on, uh, mess up how I'm able to understand that information, or it might be proactive, which is where, how I learned earlier in my life is kind of interfering with my ability to learn new information in this context. So yeah, so hopefully you're not going to forget too much of that. Hopefully it was of some use to you. And yeah, look forward to hearing any thoughts or feedback you have on any of that in Slack or in the lecture next week. So talk to you all then.